different uses of power and how people control and utilize power. So this is going to be a lecture that's very much geared towards the following groups. Nonverbal communication group, political communication group, rhetoric studies, mass comm, interpersonal. In actuality, all groups have something that they can take away from this lecture, but those are the main ones. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into today's lecture. We have quite a few things on the agenda. We have power defined. We're going to define power as best as we can. We're going to talk about forms of power, indicators of power, general indicators of power, verbal and nonverbal indicators of power, addressing power imbalances, and we're going to talk about group power. So first things first, one thing to take away from this class, from this lecture, from this chapter, is that no one is powerless. Everyone has power. Whether it is a lot of power depends on the situation, depends on the people, depends on the group, right? But everyone has power of some sort. Power is group-centered, and every member has that power. So a couple takeaways from this section of the book, of the textbook, is really talking about how every person in your group has an impact. The power that you wield is dependent on the relationships you have with these other group members. For example, as President of the United States, Richard Nixon wielded immense power. That was until the Watergate scandal, which I'm pretty sure all of you remember from high school history class. This scandal soured his relationship with the American public, and he was forced to resign his office in disgrace. So we often speak of powerful or powerless individuals as if the power distribution were all one way or the other. So what I'm saying here is normally we talk about power in absolutes. And what we learned last week was that we can't really look at most things as absolutes. In fact, everything in life, you cannot look at absolutes. And I just used an absolute by just saying that, but it's true. So no group member is completely powerless. The interconnectedness of components in a system means that all group members have some degree of influence, even if it is the sole purpose of this member to defy or resist the group, they still have power. This comes from Anthony Giddens' 1979, which was the structuration theory. We talked about structuration theory in chapter 1, but basically it explains that subordinate positions in social systems are frequently adept at converting whatever resources they possess into some degree of control, and that was on page 6. Okay, so forms of power. We have dominance, prevention, and empowerment. Dominance, or power over others, flows from a hierarchical structure or from differences in status among group members. Dominance is competitive, and the attitude when you have a dominant form of power is my gain in power is your loss. So it's really only situating and upholding individuals who have absolute dominance, people who only care about the fact that they have power rather than it being shared among other people. We then have prevention. So this is power from the efforts of others to influence. So this is really talking about defying or resisting the power dominance individual or individuals. When someone tries to dominate us, we have psychological reticence. So what that means is that we try to prevent the dominance. Prevention is also a competitive form of power. Our attitude is, how much can we defy? How much can we push the bar? How much can we push back without harming the movement, ourselves, or individuals? Next one is empowerment. We talked about empowerment in chapter 6, but empowerment is enhancing the capabilities and influence of individuals and groups. Empowerment is power to accomplish your own goals or help others achieve theirs through processes of group potency, meaningfulness, autonomy, and impact. Again, we talked about that in chapter 6. So what we're really looking for in a leader or in a group is an effective leadership style that actively seeks to increase the readiness levels of followers, thereby empowering them to accomplish tasks without the leader watching their every move. So we really want to instill this idea that our group members don't need to only adhere to the leader, where they have autonomy over what they can and cannot do. Another thing to take away from this lecture is that power, the idea, the concept of power is seen as an active struggle between the haves and have-nots. So if you think about it, I'm going to pose a question to you all, and this is an online class, so obviously think about it. But do you think that the President of the United States has more power than citizens? Take a moment to think about that. And the answer really is, in a true democratic society, is that it would be a power struggle, right? There's sometimes the president has more power than we do, and other times we have power. We put them into office, they enact laws on us. So one is stronger than the other, but it's this active struggle between who has and who does not have power. Additionally, individuals who use the second one on this list, the prevention style of power, typically are reacting to the concept of power from a negative headspace. So those who harbor a negative concept of power are usually responding to dominance and in its companion form, prevention. So dominance and prevention, when we see that, people who have negative thoughts of power react to that, and that's why it's so useful, or it's so impactful. And here's another question for you. How do politicians get us to agree with their ballot measures and the laws they put forth? How do politicians running for president get people on their side? Think about that for a second. And the answer is they use fear. They use fear to scare us. So if one politician is saying that the other politician is going to do this, this, and this, that's fear. And we might not like that. So we're going to believe the person who is instilling the fear because we believe that they are the only ones that can solve or make sure that the fear doesn't come about. So politicians definitely use this dominance mindset. And some instances they use the prevention mindset. When in actuality, they should be using the empowerment mindset, lifting up everyone. Nonetheless, we had a whole chapter or a whole section in chapter 6 about empowerment. So indicators of power, we have general indicators, verbal and nonverbal indicators of power. So let's go ahead and get into general. General, we have labeling, following, and opposing. So let's look at labeling for a second. So those who define others are exercising control. So what we're looking at here is when we define people by attaching a label to them, we are exercising power over those individuals. So for example, teachers, professors, we define students in our mind, and students define professors. For example, if I was to define all of you in the class, I would define all of you as being smart individuals, smart students. Other teachers might look at their class and might think that they're slow learners, right? There's a label that is being attached to them, and that label has power. If I define you all as smart, I'm going to expect higher quality work from you. That is a power. That is a power imbalance. Similarly, physicians define patients. Doctors might say this patient is a hypochondriac or this patient is unhealthy. There's a power there. Next, we are looking at following. So following is a good indicator of power. We all see this on social media. Whoever has the most amount of followers has a great amount of power. But life is not just social media, whether we like it or not. So, whose decisions are followed is a second general indicator of power in a group. So, the individual with the position of authority in a group, maybe a chair or a president, may not be the group member exercising the most power. They might delegate the exercising of power to someone else, or maybe they have someone else enact the rules of the group. And that other person that is given that status of enacting these laws or these rules is someone who has power, and they're exercising a following indicator of power. So basically, this section, what we're looking at for following is we're looking at who is calling the shots, who is actually doing the work in the group. That person usually has more power than the quote unquote leader. Now, for opposing, what we're really looking at here is opposing power. So that's a general indicator. So what we're looking at is those who have been accorded power by the group are usually uncomfortable with change that goes much beyond a little fine tuning. So what we're really looking at here is the active pushing back on the power that is being enacted upon us from higher ups, from people with authority. We can think of opposing indicator as protest in society, protests against different laws, different measures. That is a opposing indicator of power. Because the thing is, in protests, they do have power, regardless of how big they are, regardless of how what they're protesting against. Every protest has power. They're taking up space, right? And that actually leads to the nonverbal, or sorry, got a little bit ahead of myself. Let's look at verbal first. Hold that thought about power and space. We're going to talk about that in a second. So, verbal indicators. Power is reflected in the way we speak. Let me say that again. Power is reflected in the way we speak. So, in general, group members who use more powerful language patterns are perceived to be more credible, attractive, and persuasive than those using less powerful language. So, teachers, for example, create a positive impression by using powerful language that may make them seem significantly more dynamic, credible, organized, professional, etc. Monopolizing a conversation is also a way to show obvious power implications. Those who dominate conversations during group meetings are able to get their point presented to members. So that is actually an example of when powerful speech is not always appropriate. So of course, there's times where powerless speech is important. There's times where powerful speech is important, and we tend to listen to the powerful speech. Okay. So I said earlier to hold that idea about not about space being power, and it is a nonverbal example of power. So the example of protest. The reason why protests are effective, regardless of how big or small they are, is because they occupy space. If there is a protest that is shutting down the 80 here in Sacramento, that's going to get a lot of attention. If there's a protest shutting down Vernon Street in Roseville, that's going to get some press. That's going to get some attention. So the use of bodies, human bodies in a protest, are a great indicator of who has the power in that situation. If they're able to take up a large amount of space, they have more power. If they take up a little bit of space, they have less power. Okay. Posture and gestural communication are also markedly different for superordinates and subordinates. So the posture section. Generally, the most powerful exhibit more relaxed, casual posture and gestures. So the idea here is They have so much power that they don't care what happens. They're relaxed. They have less stress. They have less anxiety. Posture that is expansive, so that means arms that are outstretched, legs spread apart, with feet propped onto a coffee table, for example, is associated with dominance. And adopting more powerful posture can make you feel more powerful. So it's both psychological and physical. Next, touch. Um, Touch clearly indicates power relationships in groups. So think about it. People who have the right to give you a hug, for example, when they see you, some people are very picky and choosy on who gives them a hug. And you are controlling, you have power, you have autonomy over your body, and you decide who has access to it. So you are exercising power in the touch arena. Eye contact is yet another nonverbal indicator of relative degrees of power. What does that mean? It means staring is done more freely by the powerful. So people who have a lot of power tend to do a lot more eye contact. Individuals who have less power tend to not do a lot of eye contact. So eye contact, lowering your eyes and looking down indicates submissiveness, where direct eye contact and staring demonstrates dominance. Okay. And then I didn't put it on here, but we have nonverbal artifacts or symbols of power. And this is where nonverbal communication comes in terms of artifacts of clothing. For example, like a couple years ago, all we saw on TV and movies was that the powerful person in the room usually had a suit, and it was usually a male or a male identifying individual. So that kind of has gone away. The symbolic use of power, we're not really too focused on how someone's dressed and how that communicates to power for the most part. Obviously, for all of this, there are um, not absolute truths, right? So for symbolic symbols of power, we're looking at like large desks, for example, plush carpets, office windows, leather chairs, master keys, etc. So all of these big, grandiose things that communicate power. Okay, let's talk about effects of power imbalances. So, like I said at the beginning, power is an active struggle for obtaining power. Sometimes unstable distribution of power and dominance leads to power struggles. And when power struggles happen, we tend to see um, physical violence or physical displays of trying to obtain power. So we're looking at disparities that are often fostered by violent or aggressive transactions. So think about when a protest goes wrong or when a protest turns violent. That is a direct result of power struggle, a direct result of an inequality experienced by the group of protesters and by others in the community. And we can look at workplace bullying as an example of physical reactions to power struggles. Workplace bullying is a persistent form of badgering, abuse, and hammering away at targets who have less power than their bullies. According to a report by the US Justice Department, again, this book is a little bit outdated. So this was a report from 1998. But the report by the US Justice Department reported that almost 2 million people each year are victims of violence on the job. I would be interested to see if that has increased since then. I would imagine it probably has. Verbal and nonverbal contempt, or nonverbal and verbal power struggles. Power struggles in groups do not always end in physical violence, as we probably already know. Power struggles in groups do not always end in physical violence, but they do usually result in contempt. So, contempt is the expression of insult that emotionally abuses others. So, what we're looking at here is insulting others to bring them down in a group setting is a way of exercising power and leads to power struggles. So, it's something that you should avoid if you can. So, when we're looking at power, we're going to be looking at 2 videos in the discussion board this week about power. And we're going to be responding to some discussion questions, but that is our lecture for this week for power. Remember, you all have power, you all have autonomy over things that you own, things that you care about. So use your power effectively, use your power appropriately, and I'll see you guys next week.